A few weeks ago, I was coming out of Starbucks one morning, and I struck up a conversation with this man, and we talked for a few minutes, and he made several comments along the way on my distinct accent. And he said, how long have you been in Richmond? And I said, about 16 years. And he said, man, after all that time, you're still speaking Southern. Now, I failed to mention to the man that the last time I checked, Richmond was still within that boundary of the United States known as the South, but I didn't bring that up. But it did direct the rest of our conversation that morning. We started talking about all things Southern, Andy Griffith and sweet tea and all those good things. And I finally asked him, I said, have you ever heard of the Southern Dictionary? And he said, no, I've never heard of that. And I said, it's a compilation of words that we speak here in the South that many people from other parts of the United States may fail to understand. He said, really, what are some examples? I said, well, have you ever heard of a chief cook and bottle washer? And he said, no, what is that? And I said, well, it's a person capable of doing many things. And he said, really? I said, you darn tootin', that's right. And he said, darn tootin'? I said, yeah, that means, for sure or correct. And he says, man, and I said, fit to be tied. He says, fit to be tied? I said, that means angry. And he said, I'm fixing to tell you another one. And he said, fixing? What? And I said, it means to get set or be on the verge of. And then I stopped and I said, I got a hankering to go in here and get me some coffee. And I had to explain hankering to him, that it was a yearning. And finally, I just said, I don't know what in the tarnation where in the tarnation you're from, but and I had to explain to him that tarnation meant it was a term used to indicate surprise. Brian Smith caught me right before the service here, and he said he had another one. He said mayonnaise. I'd never heard of this one. He said, man, there's a lot of people out here today. Now, if you're not from the South, these words may confuse you a little bit. In fact, even if you're not Southern, there are certain words that we speak in certain parts of the country or certain dialects or certain cultures that outside that particular dialect or culture, people may have a hard time understanding. However, I have found one word that no matter what religion, culture, philosophy, or community structure it was put into, the word virtually meant the same. I want to give you a few definitions this morning and see if you can figure it out. The American dictionaries use definitions like a sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Or it could be a human emotion prompted by the pain of others. More vigorous than empathy, it's the feeling commonly gives rise to an active desire to alleviate another person's suffering. How about this one by Frederick Buechner, who is a theologian? He said, sometimes it's the fatal capacity for feeling what it is like to live inside somebody else's skin. It is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy in me until there is finally peace and joy in you. Now, maybe you're not a Jeopardy champion, but you may have figured out that the word I'm talking about this morning is compassion. Compassion is one of those things that I discovered is a spiritual characteristic and virtue in most all religions and philosophies and cultures. And its definition is almost identical as well. But as my friend at Starbucks pointed out, being from the South, I wanted a little more simpler definition without all these big words and everything. So I came up with one of my own. And it's a three-part definition, with the first part being seeing. You open your paper in the morning, or you turn on the television, or somehow you encounter a need that you see. Maybe it's a famine that has come upon a land, or a war that has brought immense oppression and poverty on a people. Maybe a plague somewhere, or a tsunami, or an earthquake has wreaked havoc on a land. Or maybe you encounter someone, a friend, or someone in your congregation who's going through a particularly tough time. So the first part of my definition is seeing. You see a need. The second part would be feeling. Now you see the need. You see this atrocity, this heartache, this hurt. but you begin to feel something inside. Maybe it's disgust, maybe it's pity, maybe it's anger, maybe it's frustration, but it's usually something that leaves us totally overwhelmed and feeling helpless. And whatever that gnawing sensation is, it begins to eat at you. And within you start hearing a small, still voice that whispers to you, that says you need to go beyond the seeing, beyond the feeling, onto the third part of my definition, which is acting. You have to do something. You have to do something with all those emotions that are boiling up in you. Now, maybe in the past you've managed to talk yourself out of it. You've said, oh, I'm too tired or too poor or too busy, too overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. But this time, you know you have to act, despite all those same excuses offering themselves, whether they're true or not. You know you have to do something. So seeing, feeling, and acting. Now, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is telling the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. In it, as Ann read earlier, a Jewish man is walking along a road between Jericho and Jerusalem. And it was a pretty rough road. There was mountains on every side, plenty of places for people who were up to no good to hide out. And sure enough, some men jumped this Jewish man. They beat him up, they robbed him, and they cast him off to the side of the road. And in the story, a priest walks by, he sees the man, he crosses to the other side of the road. A Levite comes by, he sees the man, he crosses to the other side of the road. And then a Samaritan comes along. Now, this is significant that his nationality was mentioned because Jews and Samaritans just did not get along. Now, Jesus is offering this story as a response to a man of the law in the audience who said, "Who is my neighbor?" And of all of Jesus' parables, none have worked their way into the American consciousness as much as the parable of the Good Samaritan. We hear the term Good Samaritan used a lot to describe any person who goes out of his or her way to help somebody in need. But the parable of the Good Samaritan says more than it's just good to help people in need. I mean, it is saying that, don't get me wrong. But this parable is also about excuses. It's about selfishness. It's about complacency. The parable of the Good Samaritan is about indifference. All the things that are opposite of compassion. I mean, if you really want to know how to not practice compassion, then do absolutely nothing. Put yourself first. Think about your needs before you do the needs of others. Place yourself on a higher plane of existence than everybody else around you. Now, maybe somebody thinks that sounds a little harsh. And maybe you are thinking, well, I would never be so callous. I would never think myself better than others. I would never put myself in front of somebody else. And I pray this morning that that is true. But the fact is that many of our neighborhoods, our churches, our cities, our country, and our world, in many cases, has become hardened to the needs of the world around them. They have shut out the cries of the needy. We have gotten into a habit of centering ourselves into our own little world, into our own thoughts, into what affects us. We have become apt to ignore or even condemn others who do not act as we act or think as we think. However, I do believe that in most cases this oversight is not malicious. I believe it's just an act of complacency. Now, complacency is one of those terms that means just taking things as they are, just accepting things the way they are and letting everything else roll off to the side. When I was in seminary, a professor asked us one time, we were studying, and I meant to look this up and I didn't, the scripture in the Bible that talks about the armor of God. It's in the New Testament somewhere. You'll read it sometime. He was talking about the armor of God, and he said, now what is Satan's two greatest weapons? Is it anger? Is it lust? Is it murder? I said, no, I think the two greatest weapons that Satan has is selfishness and complacency.